let's tell a little bit of the backstory, and y'all could continue to chime in with your thoughts on this as well as your thoughts on the record. So here's what I got here. The Beach Boys is the story of America, and specifically of the Golden West Coast of Southern California, all full of promise and sunshine, and then packaged and sold to every kid who ever dreamt of the ocean. It's a family of brothers and a cousin and a close friend, eventually learning to despise each other. So, the Wilson family grew up in a place called Hawthorne, California. It's a suburb south of Los Angeles. There's Brian, the oldest brother. There's Dennis, the middle brother, aka the fuck up. And then there's Carl, the youngest. And their first cousin is a guy called Mike Love. First cousin grows up with them, and he's also in the band. And ultimately, rounding out this band is their friend, a guy called Al Hardine or Jardine. So let's just break down the instruments they play, although they do kind of switch around a bit. Everyone in this band sings. And from their inception in during high school to up to this record and beyond, it's these how many guys is it? Six guys? One, two, three, four.
I see 5 on the cover of Beach Boys
Five guys.
today.
Five
I don't
guys.
know.
Five cable knit sweaters. Okay. So Al Jardine plays bass on most of the recordings, though weirdly every clip I see shows Brian with a bass on stage. I don't
Yeah.
quite know why that is. He does play a lot of records, but one thing I wanted to point out, just because we mentioned it on a recent episode, that Brian is also the falsetto voice on all these recordings. So going in direct opposition to the bass player having the lowest voice. But okay,
Yeah.
Al Hardine is listed
More
as
like
player
more
on
like
these
Eagles.
records.
Bass player has the high voice.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Exactly.
MTV
So he's got
Schmidt.
one end of the spectrum or the other. Dennis Wilson is the guy who plays drums. Carl Wilson and Mike Love both play guitar, and Brian plays a lot of things, as we're going to see, but often piano, sometimes guitar, sometimes harpsichord, random things like that, right? And first things first, I wanted to mention that, like a lot of bands of this era, they don't play on a lot of their recordings from this period. The Wrecking Crew is actually all over this album. They always sing on the recordings, but they don't always play.
So I actually I made a connection at a point during this week, which was that, oh, that's why everybody has to sing on every track, because otherwise they're not doing shit on some of these songs. It's like what am I contributing to this? We got Carol Kay on bass, we got the Wrecking Crew filling out all the sounds. I have to contribute something. How about we just throw another voice in there? Yeah, I'm just gonna be in the background doing some weird counter melody thing, like she knows me or something like that, which it led to some busyness in the backgrounds that I found to be not very palatable over the course of the week.
I think we'll find on the first song it's particularly sus.
Wow, that's a double meaning there, huh?
Yeah.
A lot of chord extensions in these harmonies. Okay, so Brian Wilson, right? He is generally regarded as the mastermind behind the group. He was musical from an early age. His father mentioned that he remembers him mimicking back his own little bits of singing in a note perfect way even before he could talk. And all the kids showed some talent, but Brian was the oldest and kind of the ringleader, right? So naturally, with such talented kids, it makes sense that you'd fly into abusive rages frequently and hit your son Brian so hard in the side of the head when he was 6 as to make him permanently deaf in one ear.
Wow.
Holy shit.
Yeah. I have to imagine that Brian is somewhere on the spectrum too, right?
Absolutely.
The description of, oh, even before he could talk, he could sing, but he can't be a normal human being. It's like, okay, that's
right.
There's something going on there.
And he struggled a lot very publicly with mental health over the years. It kind of starts right around this period, as I think was already alluded to. And so I don't want to make too much light of that, but I did watch a Beach Boys documentary that was filmed in the 70s, and they're interviewing all the Beach Boys, and they're all kind of bearded and looking 70s, shaggy. And Brian is being interviewed in his bed with the covers pulled up all the way to his neck and like not acknowledging at all, but that's his whole interview.
Normal, right?
Maybe he was just hoping for world peace, he's doing a lie-in for world peace.
So Okay. So their father, Murray Wilson, was an abusive drunk, and the boys growing up found out that music was the best way to avoid their dad's tantrums. See, the thing is that Murray Wilson he loved music as well, and in fact, he was a failed songwriter and arranger himself, and so he sought to live his rock and roll dreams vicariously through his kids. It's always a great plan, guys.
Very healthy. Yes. agreed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So wait, as failed songwriters, we get to hit our kids? Is that what I'm hearing now?
That's the rule.
Yeah. Before you force them to become songwriters.
Oh, yeah.
So they have
I'm
something to
sorry,
write
kids. I don't
about.
make the rules.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
just follow the playbook here.
But look, this is the 1950s. It's a wholesome time for America, and I do think context is really important for this record, both cultural and musical. So a young Brian heads off to high school in Southern California, where he is the quarterback of the high school football team. I found that fact insane. And
Yeah.
it's a fruitful time.
Can you repeat that?
Brian Wilson was the quarterback of his high school football team.
So he's
Is it a
just been
musical high school and he just happened to be the tallest or something?
Right.
Yeah, it's like
the
fame.
performing arts school.
Right, exactly.
Right.
So you're telling me that he has just been ripping through the ladies since he was like 14 years old. He's just been the coolest and the most popular and sought after boy. That's
I assume it
fucking
was
annoying.
a very white and kind of upper class high school where maybe there wasn't as much competition. But
Fair
yeah,
enough. When they played the inner city schools, they were just getting shut out 77-0.
look, he's kind of a hefty guy. That must have been part of pushing him towards football, right? He's a little bit of a chunky dude, or he was back then. But he's going through his life in the early 1950s, and this is the era of early rock and roll, right? A lot of cool stuff is happening. Chuck Berry, Bill Haley and the Comets, Little Richard. And then one day on the radio, Brian hears it's a lightning strike. What does he hear? The Four Freshmen. It's got harmony. It's got dorky white guys in cable knit sweaters. It's got everything Brian has ever wanted in music. So we will play a clip of that momentarily, but basically this song, or this group, the Four Freshmen, which was basically like a barbershop quartet or a doo-wop group, if you will, inspires Brian to start his first vocal group. He enlists Mike Love, his cousin, this guy he grew up with, and his brothers who are younger than him, and pretty much forces them, whether they want to or not, to sing with him. And right off the bat, he insists on taking on extremely challenging arrangements. In fact, the very first time they sang together, they attempted the Four Freshmen's It's a Blue World. Now, apparently the first time they tried this out, it completely crashed and burned, unsurprisingly. It's very challenging, but this was no deterrent. So let's just play a clip from the Four Freshmen's It's a Blue World.
Just so our audience knows, when we do the episodes, whoever's hosting sends out the focus list, and this song was on the focus list. And a minute after listening to it, I wrote back to the group and said, this is probably one of the most beautiful vocal arrangements I've ever heard in my life. So I understand why they were obsessed with this.
I feel like trying to sing this song, if you've never sang in a vocal group before, would be like trying to do synchronized swimming with other people and none of you can swim. Like something of this level, right? Like this is
Yeah.
so insane.
Everybody just jumps in the pool
Yeah,
and is
yeah.
flailing around, and they're like,
They're
"Why
like,
is
you
it
got-
working?"
I'll be on the left. So I think I got it. You know? So-
Honestly, I was a little taken aback by this song actually had more edge than a lot of the songs on Beach Boys today did.
That's the
It had more
thing.
pathos. Yeah.
These guys sound like they F. The Beach Boys
Yeah.
just sound like boys. And this is actually a compliment to them that Beach Boys is a great name for them for that reason. They really sound boyish in just so
Yeah.
many ways. And that was funny to me too, Tom. I'm glad you mentioned that. By the way, the Four Freshmen are still touring.
Good Lord.
They're
Having
gonna
the
be
nursing home
after-
circuit? Is that a thing?
No. I think all the original members have swapped out for younger bucks.
For
But
young
you
living
notice they're
members.
keeping the tradition alive. They're going to be at the First Presbyterian Church of Bonita Springs in Florida in March.
So a nursing home circuit. That's essentially what you're
So
talking
so
about.
go check them out. I also
Hey,
read
man, pays the bills.
I totally processed that as First Unitarian Church. And I was like, whoa.
Oh yeah, the
Yeah,
Philly
right.
venue that
Yeah.
like actually gets good bands. No.
I just assume Unitarian churches are all,
Super
different.
hip.
Yeah, super hip. Yeah.
So I read a little note about these guys that they started in the 40s as a barbershop outfit in Indiana, and they eventually got on the radar of some jazz guys like Dizzy Gillespie and Stan Kenton, who helped them get a deal with Capitol. They were dropped from Capitol when they submitted the song "It's a Blue World," and Capitol's like, "No, this is terrible. We're not releasing this." And they ended up getting dropped from the label, getting the song back, promoting it themselves, and it became their first charting single in 1952, which is where Brian heard it on the radio.
Didn't
So
even
go
have
figure.
voter hats on or anything, like straying from that barbershop aesthetic. Come on.
Vaudeville scene.
So they're in this singing group. It's up and down. The brothers are at sort of different levels of commitment to the band through high school. And then Brian goes off to college locally in Southern California and starts searching around for topics to write songs about. Spoiler alert, this search proved very, very successful. He noticed one day that his younger brother Dennis was constantly talking about this new trend that had him getting up early in the morning, hanging out all day on the beach, and using crazy slang terms like cowabunga, which is actually something people said, not just the Ninja Turtle catchphrase. Now, of course, I'm talking about surfing. And at the time, surfing was still a fairly niche hobby for SoCal hipsters. And I wanted to take just a very brief tangent into the history of surfing. And if you guys know more, please let me know. But it seems as though there's versions of surfing that cropped up independently hundreds of years ago in a few different places in the world. But most agree that modern surfing originated in Hawaii around 1600 years ago. And it mostly stayed with Polynesians until around the turn of the century, when a land baron named Henry Huntington decided to actively import it to California as a marketing technique for some of his properties along the beach. So he literally paid surfers to come surf waves so that tourists would roll up to his property and think it was cool. But in any case, it didn't really become cool for working class white kids to do it until right around this time. It was just starting to take off as a hobby for young people in Southern California, young working class white kids. And so Dennis, the middle brother rather, was super into surfing. He couldn't stop blathering about it to his brothers, and he kept missing singing practice for it. And so Brian has this light bulb moment, decides to start writing songs about it. Now, the very first Beach Boys single is simply called Surfin'. They recorded in a budget studio together. And as soon as Daddy Murray Wilson hears the song, he declares himself the Beach Boys manager, in parentheses for life. That leads us straight to our favorite segment here on the show. It's Beach Boys by the numbers. So they record Surfin'. The first number I want to throw out to you is 50,000. That's the number of copies their very first single sold. Off the strength of that, Murray, the dad, is able to help get them a deal at Capitol Records.
Wow. Now that had to have been just around California, right? Like, or
No,
were they
apparently
shipping them out across the country?
I believe they were shipping them out across the country. That's the only way you could sell that
Wow.
many, I feel like.
Yeah. Okay.
I think they hit right at the crest of the wave, pun intended, of when America knew about surfing but didn't know enough about it. They needed information about it, and these songs I think started coming in fast and hot.
Have you guys just like, wow, I just listened to Surfin'. Are you guys familiar with this song?
I've heard it, yeah.
No.
You could change
Is this
surfing out
different than
with
Surfing
pooping. It sounds like
USA?
children's music. Dude. You could swap it out with pooping, and you've got a whole children's thing here, man.
Yeah, how
This
old are
is-
they when they put that out?
11.
I think Brian is probably like 21 or 22, but that puts his youngest brother
Oh
at
God.
something like 18 or 17.
Guys, imagine this, right? Brian Wilson is on the football field. He pops up his football helmet, his long locks of hair flow out, and he just starts singing his high falsetto about surfing.
Okay. So speaking of surfing, the next number I want to throw out to you guys is 12. That's the number of songs with the word surf in the title that the Beach Boys put out as singles.
Shut up.
I have a list for you. Surfing, Surfers Rule, Surfing Safari, Surfing USA, Little Surfer Girl, Noble Surfer, The Surfer Moon, Rockin' Surfer, South Bay Surfer, Surf Jam, Surfs Up, and Still Surfing.
Oh my God.
I'm guessing Still Surfing is like 2019 or something
Yeah,
like that.
that was later. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was later. But listen, and I haven't even included the songs that are most definitely about surfing that just don't happen to have the word surf directly in the title, like Catch a Wave, The Warmth of the Sun, or Girls on the Beach. The list goes on, fellas. This was a gold mine, okay?
Damn.
Lord. It's like in
Check
the
out
90s, you write a song about rollerblading or something like that. And it just happens to hit right at the right time. And you're still like, let's rollerblade again like we did last summer, 20 years later.
So the next number, and it purposely comes on the heels of that last little piece. The next number is the number 1. As in, of all the members of the Beach Boys, there's only one who ever surfed. Save for Dennis, none of the Beach Boys surf in any way, shape,
And
or form.
90% of their career is built around it.
Exactly.
That is fantastic.
That's got to be so disappointing. You're like on vacation in Hawaii and you run into one of the Beach Boys. You're like, yeah, man, let's go catch a wave. We'll be sitting on top of the world. You're like, actually, it's not really my thing.
Yeah, I've never really gotten up. It's kind of challenging. I don't really want to put in the time. Yeah, Dennis is the only one. So very, very interesting. But okay, for the last number, though, to round out this segment, I'm sure you know that even though this Beach Boys album comes a bit before Brian Wilson's very public struggles with mental health, couldn't help but bring up a couple strange Brian Wilson anecdotes here. So the last number I want to throw out there is 4, as in 4 hours. This is the amount of time that Brian Wilson would reportedly sit in his living room by himself, listening to a self-made tape loop of the Ronettes' Be My Baby chorus. Not even the song, just the chorus.
Just the chorus?
Now, you do that for 4 hours straight at high volume. And I calculated it. The chorus is all of 14 seconds. That's over 1,000 loops of the chorus.
If
Wow.
that's what it takes to
Why?
write Pet Sounds, I'm not writing Pet Sounds.
Right.
I'm not going to do that.
That's pretty messed up. See, something's going on.
Something's definitely going on. He was obsessed with Phil Spector. We see that, I think, a little bit on the Beach Boys today. Phil Spector's the guy who produced the song Be My Baby. It is a great song, by the way. It's a great example of Phil Spector's wall of sound approach, but that is overkill by anyone's measure. And speaking of filling your ears with utter nonsense for hours and hours for the sake of trance-like enjoyment, we love you, dear listeners, and we love doing this show. We learn so much and are gaining new appreciation all the time, and that's 100% because of you. So thank you. To help keep us motivated to dig deeper and deeper, support us however you can by listening, by sharing with a friend, giving us a 5-star rating, or even better, grabbing some of our merch or joining the Patreon page and effectively buying us a beer. All this stuff is linked in the show notes, and we love you for it. We reinvest every cent back into making the show bigger and better for you. Okay, back to Southern California for a moment. This is the early 60s. America was simpler then. The Beach Boys start pumping out surf-related hits and touring very successfully. Now, in a pre-Beatles, pre-60s cultural revolution America, they are legitimately the biggest band in the US. They expand from surfing to songs about cars every once in a while. These wholesome lads have tapped into something in the American youth consciousness. Hit after hit. Surfing comes out in 1961 and charts. In 1962, they have 3 more charting singles. In 63, it's 7 charting singles. And by 64, it's 10 charting singles, including their first #1 hit, which is called I Get Around. which is a great song, by the way.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. That
So
makes sense. I had a tape growing up that was just the best of the Beach Boys. And it was 6 tracks on each side of the cassette. And they were all killers. I mean, they're all, fun pop songs, but they all crushed.
No
that's why
doubt.
that's why I say the timing I think is really important because we're pre-Beatles landing in America. That's a pretty big event.
Yeah. Right.
You know,
Right.
it was just a really different time. I think so much happened kind of in the mid to late 60s, culturally even, let alone musically, that it is a little hard to fathom how this was the most popular stuff in America, but it was.
It's also the rise of the American teenager in the like early to mid 60s. Like teenagers as a concept was not that old. It used to just be like, well, you graduated from 8th grade, go get a job.
Go get it.
Slacker. And then in the kind of post World War II baby boom era, teenagers was labeled as this period of life where you get to have new experiences and you have less responsibilities and you can kind of explore yourself. And so, you talk about 1945, the war ends. These babies are becoming teenagers in the late 40s, early 50s. I'm sorry, the late 50s, early 60s.
Yeah.
And there's also not only a new market to sell to, but there's a new attitude about what those people should be doing. It's not go get a job at the coal mine. It's go surf and have fun, get a car, ride around, be true to your girl and all that stuff. And they really tapped into the zeitgeist very well.
Yeah, and in addition to that, it's also the rise of mass-produced media. Television is still pretty new. The recording industry is still pretty new, and both are rapidly expanding as a way to get those kinds of messages that Tom just mentioned out to the public and to reinforce them, right? And like you said, a new group to consume that media. So, okay, so back to the story. In the lead up to the release of Today, or the Beach Boys Today as it's known, they're touring a lot. They're touring in Europe, they're touring in America. They're recording and releasing kind of in between on tour stops, basically more singles through 1964 and releasing them as singles. And these include a couple of the tracks that end up on this album, meaning they were released before the album came out. Brian is already having some mental health issues, and I think it's partly the boost of success that they get from I Get Around that leads him to one of the first of many of his nervous breakdowns, where he basically decides not to tour with the group anymore, or at least very rarely. And at first, Glenn Campbell fills in, the Rhinestone Cowboy himself, I believe came up on a recent episode.
Yeah.
Later, at some point, they get a lookalike to tour with them consistently,
Sure.
and no one really notices
No
because
way.
Wow.
we're in that
Wow.
era of America. So, side note, some of Brian's anxiety is really a crazed jealousy about being on the road while his first wife, Marilyn, is at home. And so, in an effort to calm his nerves, they get married quite impulsively at the end of 1964, which is really right in the middle of the recording sessions for this album, right smack in the middle. When they get married, she's 16 years old. He's 22. And by the way, he met her when she was 14.
Yikes.
Ooh, yeah. This is getting less and less wholesome as we go
We're
down.
we're gonna cover this in the first song on the playlist.
So, but look, the story does have a reasonably happy ending. They actually stayed together for something like 15 years. And for our younger but not too young,
Until she was like 29. Okay.
just for the benefit of our young but not too young listeners, this is the marriage that produced Carney and Wendy Wilson, later to form the group Wilson Phillips and have that banger of a hit, Hold On.
How did
Oh,
I
yeah.
not know that? Big,
Yeah,
big
I feel like I
gap.
kind of
on
didn't.
The
I-
Phillips part of that.
Yeah, I feel like I
People
kind of didn't
surrounding
know that too. Yeah.
You know,
But
it
just
is
never put
really
it together.
interesting. It is really interesting though, Rob, right? Like if you look at their studio album chronology, you got Surfing Safari, Surfing USA, Surfer Girl, Deuce Coupe, something, all summer long. They put out a Christmas record, which is great, by the way. I actually got it this year for Christmas. It's fabulous. But like wholesome as could be. And then as soon as they get married, this other vibe creeps in,
Right.
right? Like instantly.
It's called
kinda.
regret, Phil.
So pretty much right after that marriage, they head back into the studio to finish up this record. And there is a lot happening, like you said, Phil. It's the marriage, but also America's changing. These clean-cut California kids are changing with the fame. Brian's recently been introduced to, gasp, marijuana. And musically, the landscape has shifted under their feet because, as we know, in 1964, four lads from Liverpool drop onto America and make somewhat of a splash. So Brian hears the Beatles and, of course, admires them and sees the competition and wants to expand the songwriting palette, understandably, and also the instruments he's using in order to keep up. So now here we are kind of at the cusp of the Beach Boys today, half of which sounds pretty much exactly like all the surf pop tunes, but the other half is starting to sound a lot more progressive and interesting and heading in the direction of their masterpiece Pet Sounds. And what do we mean by that? Well, the songs here, I think, are both a departure from on the back half. They're a departure both in terms of subject matter, where Wilson is writing a little more autobiographically and positioning himself as sort of a neurotic, unreliable narrator, which seems pretty close to his real self, but also because the arrangements are getting much grander. No tracks on this entire record rely solely on what you might call standard rock band instrumentation, like guitar, bass, drums. They all have touches of orchestral stuff or other instruments outside the rock world. And of course, the vocal arrangements are getting more lush. There's more 9 chords, 7 chords, and extensions beyond that, which we're going to touch on. So here we are at the recording of the Beach Boys today. So, like I said, they had done a couple singles on the road kind of over the summer of 1964, but the bulk of the record was recorded between January 7th and January 19th in 1965, mostly in LA at a place called Western Studio, although they also stopped by a place called Gold Star Studio. And this must have been back in 1964. They actually did one of the songs, Dance, 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 at a studio in Nashville. Now, we've already brought his name up a couple times, but apart from the Beatles, Brian was also obsessed with Phil Spector. And so for a long time had been using the session musicians that Phil Spector would use at a lot of his sessions. People like Hal Blaine, Carol Kaye, Leon Russell, they're on this recording, and they're also known as the Wrecking Crew, which I think at that time, that name even was still like a relatively new name for them. I think, it had been, the Wrecking Crew was a loose affiliation of studio musicians who kind of got that name over time. It wasn't referring to one specific band exactly, but I think the Wrecking Crew name might not have even been spoken at this point. I'm not sure though.
Yeah, did they work with the Carpenters, speaking of really clean cut harmonies and inoffensive music? So I feel like I remember
they did, yeah.
Up. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, they did. I think they were kind of the guys in LA.
The go-tos, yeah.
Yeah, the guys and gals, right? And so I think they would just became the LA group of killers that various studios, this is my understanding, which is limited, would call in for their sessions. And then I think over time they kind of gained this name as this loose affiliation, this cadre of musicians. So
well, but they also had that reputation of, we'll record your album in a day. You come in and we're going to bust out 12 tracks in one day that we've never heard before, because they are consummate pros. And it must have been a switch, because my understanding is that they spent a lot of time on these tracks. They were spending weeks on individual tracks as opposed to a day on an album type of thing.
So you bring up a good point, which is I think the use of studio musicians, which sounds a little bit alien to us now, the idea that a band which is touring and playing their own music live every night would not be the band that records the songs in the studio seems a little weird, but it was done mostly for efficiency purposes. Like you're saying, Tom, like what's the fastest, cheapest way we can get this done? The professionals are going to be better at it, which they almost certainly were. But that said, the Beach Boys spent a lot of time on this. It wasn't always. Two things. One, the Beach Boys do play on a handful of these tracks, which makes sense. They would have taken a bit longer to get those band tracks down. But I think where a lot of the time was spent was in the post-production, was in the arrangement of vocals and the rearrangement of vocals and the takes of vocals, and then all the other stuff they added, the timpani and the timbales and the wood
That weird
blocks and
harpsichord sounding thing.
right.
Yeah.
And I think, and one of the reasons Brian Wilson said he wanted to stop touring, I think he was having a lot of anxiety and stage fright from traveling, like we said, but his other reason was to focus full time on the thing he actually liked, which was to write and produce music. So he really was starting to take control at this point. And it's interesting because another thing that they were always struggling with, I mentioned their dad, their abusive, controlling father, who also helped them get their first record deal, I should say, and clearly shepherded them through some of this. They had pushed him out as manager at this point, and yet he was still hanging around and exerting a lot of influence. And there's some like tapes of, I think it's during the Help Me Rhonda sessions, where Brian and the dad are arguing back and forth like during the take. And the dad is just, he's a real dick. I mean, he's just like questioning everything Brian does and like how he's doing it. And he exerted a lot of psychological control over the band, even though he wasn't still the manager, right?
That sounds really shitty. And also, objectively, as an observer, you'd think he'd turn around and go to his dad like, do you have any number one hits? No? Shut the fuck up. All right. I'm the guy writing the music here. But it's your dad. You can't probably,
Right.
you're not well psychologically.
I was just about to say, like, you don't have a dad?
Yeah, I know I got a dad. And I shut my mouth a lot.
You're right.
So it's funny you mentioned that aspect, because there was another anecdote about how when after the band officially pushed Murray out as the manager, he immediately runs out and signs a spite band called the Sun Rays, and then dresses them exactly like his sons, the Beach Boys, in an attempt to
way.
repeat this
Oh,
success.
man.
Yeah.
His son spelled S-O-N.
That's a religious one.
It should
Oh,
be.
man.
It should be. Okay.
Rob, I have a question around
Sure. Yeah. Sure.
the recording process here, and I don't know if you have a good answer to this. I was looking up the top albums of 1965, and I'm seeing that, like, the Who's the Who's My Generation is on that list. Bringing It All Back Home, Highway 61 Revisited, Rubber Soul. Was Brian Wilson feeling pressure to mature the subject matter and to mature the lyrics at all to keep up with some of this more worldly material that was coming out?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Especially in regards to the Beatles, but I'm sure he was aware of those other things that were happening in the culture and in the music as well. And I think he was kind of at dual purposes. He wanted to retain this sense of orchestral grandeur, this Phil Spector wall of sound. How do I use the studio as an instrument? How do I maximize? I'll give you an example. Like, I happened upon the Wikipedia article for multi-track recording this week, and the Beach Boys are featured prominently in the history cited in that article, as are the Beatles, right? They were both trying to push the limits of what was possible. So I think that simultaneously Brian cared about subject matter competition, but maybe even more so, he cared about what the Beatles were doing in the studio with the studio, things that a live band could not do.
Interesting.
So this album sees him doing things like doubling up bass parts, tripling up keyboard parts to make everything richer. There's something like 11 total musicians per song. There's takes going into the 30s. I think he was demanding more perfection, and he was sort of adding more. And I do think the chord extensions got more complex here. One of the more interesting things going on is when you start to break these songs down, they have simple underlying chord progressions. They have simple melodies, but how the harmonies are built can be quite strange. There's some like sharp 11s, and there's some really weird stuff going on that I imagine felt subversive, at least to him at the time.
For people who are maybe not super familiar with harmonic theory, we want to talk a little bit about like how chords are constructed. Usually, like, the chord that you think of is a root, a third, and a fifth, and it's a 3-note chord. There's a lot of
The Three Stooges.
songs are
Hello,
3-note
hello,
chords.
hello. Right.
Yeah, exactly. when you start getting into these extensions of chords and flatting fives and, you know, sharp nines and all that stuff, that's where it gets to be these weird, super lush sounds. Like you hear a C chord and you're like, that's a C chord. And you hear like, you know, a C sharp 11 and you're like, that's a different chord than it sounds the same, but there's just a weird flavor on it that makes it sound a lot
I
different.
think flavor is a really great word to use. I think those extensions really are sort of, especially when they get the higher you get, right? It's they have a weird, they put a weird polish on the sound. Um, Also, in this case, Tom, and I'm sure you know you hear it all over this, right? There's this intense use of the major seven, right, which is the you know the major chord with that fourth note added on the end, and also the minor chord, right, with that with it, the one note added just above it, right, and it's like the prevalence of these two chords just creates a whole vibe, right? Like
Like you said, it's like the Beach Boys sound. It really
it's their yeah,
does.
total
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's what defines their sound. And these ideas are also, we should say, borrowed from classical music, orchestral music, which uses a lot of instruments stacked on top of each other, playing these distinct notes, right, to create these more complex harmonies. And then it's also influenced by jazz harmony. You know, jazz was the other area of music where they're using these kinds of chords and these kinds of harmonic ideas. So bringing them into pop music, which I think the Beach Boys did, especially vocally, but also bands like the Beatles did in a lot of their music, helped expand the palette of what was possible in pop music. But since we're talking about those chord extensions, I actually think this is a great segue to start talking about some of these songs.